Football at 4 with Geoff Mosher.
My personality is I want to win badly. I want to win more Lombardis for Philadelphia and our fans. We got the greatest fans around, and I will do everything possible.
Powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. This is Football at 4.
And he says he'll do everything in his power to try to win another Lombardi. Well, they won one, and 5 years later they have a shot to win another. Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds, is back for Football at 4. I want to get his thoughts on the CEO, the owner of this team, Jeffrey Lurie. And Jeff, you know, when he bought this team was kind of a franchise that was on the way down. They were in all sorts of disarray, and he brings in Andy Reid. What role do you think Jeff Lurie has in why this franchise is where they are right now?
Oh, a big one, Mike. I mean, unmistakably a huge one. We like people, whether they're coaches, whether they're general managers, but even in an owner's situation, you want someone who's aggressive, who's not afraid to be, someone who's not risk averse all the time. And certainly Jeffrey Lurie is involved in, you can debate at times in the franchise history where maybe too much, maybe, we talked about that before, but there are a lot of absentee owners who don't really know the league. Jeffrey Lurie prides himself on knowing the league, knowing the game, knowing the way the game's going, and being a good judge of who's a good leader of men. And I think before all that, Mike, the Eagles had a sort of a bad history of ownership before Jeffrey Lurie took over, of owners who were either trying to make a buck or save a buck. That's why they bought the team. I think it's pretty clear that Jeffrey Lurie bought the Eagles because he wanted to be an NFL owner so badly and wanted to then be the owner of a dominant franchise, a winning franchise. Winning came, in his mind, in part with buying the Eagles. It wasn't just about making a quick buck and how can he make money while not spending a lot of money. And that obviously is a huge, huge reason when you compare him to some other owners, especially back in those days, who were buying franchises because they thought it was going to get them richer.
You know, Moshe, when we're younger, I don't think we ever take into account what an owner means, and having stable ownership and having a good ownership means to the success of a franchise. They don't play, right? So I guess, is Jeffrey Lurie a good example of why ownership does matter?
Absolutely. And you're correct. Not something that you always hear about it, good ownership, bad ownership. And even as a kid, you knew some of the good and bad teams were good teams did have the good owners, the bad ones had the bad ones, but you sort of didn't know why, right? What makes an owner a bad owner? And it wasn't until I got involved as a journalist and got involved with the game and saw the differences. You would talk to players who came from other teams and say what the Eagles have that those teams don't have, as far as resources, from the practice bubble to the NovaCare facilities to the way the link is built and maintains its football integrity, to how the owner treats the players, their families. You always heard great things about how the Eagles take care of their players and how they always have the top resources, and how if there's something that you can find a direct link to winning, the Eagles are at least trying to explore that. And also just understanding as an owner, the league itself. Every time you see a team fire a coach, and then you see that owner has to hire a consulting firm to help point them into the direction of its new coach, you realize that's because the owner doesn't spend enough time getting to understand and know the league. Like most people, whether it's you or me or, journalists who cover the league nationally or locally, I could come up with a list of future head coaches based on people I speak to in the league who would vouch for their reputation. Now, they may not all work out, but they're people who, in general, are widely regarded around the league for what they do. And if an owner doesn't know that and needs help in deciding not who to pick as the head coach, but who the candidates should be, that shows you that ownership is missing that element of really wanting to be involved to the point where they know how to really run a franchise and what it takes to find a leader of that franchise.
Right, and then, it's ironic that here's Jeffrey Lurie. We're talking about him getting back to the Super Bowl, and obviously they're facing the Chiefs and Andy Reid. And a lot of what the Eagles are today, you can trace back to their first decision of hiring Andy Reid, how that decision impacted who they are today.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And that's, Jeffrey's sort of his pride, right? He interviewed Andy Reid at a time where nobody else wanted to hire Andy Reid. And it's not like he just picked Andy Reid's name out of a hat. Again, he was so involved that he knew who some of the rising assistant position coaches were. And then once he got them in their chair, and you can probably say the same thing with Nick Sirianni, who also did not have other interviews, then Jeffrey Lurie switches into the mode of, now I have to figure out, is this person the right person to lead my franchise based on the answers to the questions that they're providing me and how they present themselves and where they're going with their mindset. Andy had this big, thick binder, and he impressed Jeffrey Lurie with where Andy thought the game was going from a passing standpoint. He was absolutely dead on about it, and Jeffrey Lurie already had the feeling that that's what he was looking for. And similarly with Nick Sirianni, there had to have been something in that interview that Jeffrey felt this was a guy who not only could be a good leader of men, but shares the same long-term vision for the franchise that I share. Because you remember, Jeffrey Lurie, it sort of sounded weird at the time when he fired Doug Peterson. He said Doug didn't deserve to be fired and would get a head coaching job someday. But the biggest issue when they had that second meeting was sort of the vision for the future, and that's where they must have had irreconcilable differences, and it was an unpopular move for some at the time, but here the Eagles are back in the Super Bowl.
Crazy, right? Crazy to think they fired a guy who won a Super Bowl, unpopular at the time, and yet they're back with a new quarterback and a new coach in the Super Bowl. And then, we talk a little bit about how they got here from a 4-win team, but it was really that fork-in-the-road decision at how much, I guess, Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman, by some extent, I want to get into their relationship and that in just a second here, but that fork-in-the-road decision that had to be approved, I would imagine, by Jeff Lurie to pull the plug on Carson Wentz and take that cap hit.
Well, of course, Jeffrey Lurie is involved in every single, transaction that happens. He knows, I'm not saying he makes them, I'm just saying he knows whether or not the team is going to go forward, and there are times where he has to give his thumbs up or thumbs down. In that situation, Carson made it pretty clear he wanted out. So it sort of forced the Eagles' hand in that regard. They could have tried to say, you're under contract, you're going to play, and you're going to adapt to this new coaching staff. But they didn't do that. They just felt that, it's sort of like a marriage. If someone tells you they love you, but they don't really love you, it's probably best not to try to make it work. It's time to move on. And they took that cut. And I think I would agree with you in the sense that Jeffrey had to have understood that once they made that move, it may be difficult, maybe take a little bit to build it up. And obviously last year it came with some real growing pains. It looked a lot better at the end, but it was only a short year. It was 1 year of growing pains, not too many, because the faith that he had in Howie to be able to rebuild it was there, and he let Howie do his thing.
Crazy. And we were talking a little bit about this earlier. They won 4 games that year. Wentz was obviously terrible. But, and this kind of wraps into today's team, that year in 2020, one of the issues they had was not only Wentz playing poorly, their offensive line was a disaster. And one of the reasons they got back to the playoffs so quickly 1 year later, that offensive line last year was just as dominant as it was this year. They just didn't have the skill players to have the results of the plays end up, as well. They ran the ball last year behind that line at a very good pace. They just didn't have the playmakers on the outside like they do now. But that offensive line, people forget, were they a 4-win team in 2020 because they were just a franchise in disarray? Maybe not. They just had a ton of injuries that year, and now that offensive line, which was hurt in 2020, is the same. Many of the same pieces are now anchoring this team on Super Bowl Sunday.
Absolutely. And this goes back to the sort of the Andy Reid fingerprints on the organization, and then coinciding with how Jeffrey Lurie and Joe Banner, I have to put him in there. That was a big period for the Eagles in which they learned a lot about how to build a team and also how to be aggressive despite what the optics might look like. And what I mean by that is they learned through the Andy Reid era that offensive line and defensive line play in the trenches is paramount to winning football games. You can have great quarterback, that's important. You can have great corners, pass rushers. It's not that those are important, but offensive lines and of course defensive lines are paramount to winning. And when you look at the Eagles, and I raise my hand, I've been critical at times of their draft approach, but in the last 2 years, they have spent second-round picks, high picks, on offensive linemen who were not supposed to play when they were drafted. Cam Jurgens really hasn't played this year. And then last year they drafted Dickerson in the second round, but they had Brandon Brooks and Sayamalu. It's just that Brooks, I believe it was Brooks, or say one of them got hurt, and Dickerson was forced in pretty early and then wound up starting most of the games as a rookie. Some people get annoyed. They say, you have so many needs at corner and safety. And I say it too, at linebacker. I say, how can you go this long drafting the same kind of players and not addressing areas that have hurt you? And it has hurt them in the past. You can look at 2019 and 2020 and say maybe you had won some games if you had drafted and developed corners and safeties. But they stick with offensive line, and when Jason Kelce decides to hang it up, they expect that Cam Jurgens will be able to go in there just the way Landon Dickerson did last year when Brandon Brooks came out. And they will always draft offensive linemen. They will now always draft quarterbacks higher than we might think, like they showed us with Jalen Hurts. They are not afraid to take those kind of risks and make those kind of decisions in areas that they deem to be priority positions.
Geoff Mosher, InsideTheBirds.com. Interesting, obviously this team, and this is a big game for them because of what's coming up down the road. I don't want to, look at their offseason so much here, but Brandon Graham did say last night, he was on with Zach Gelb on CBS Sports Radio and said he definitely is playing next year. His wife did acknowledge, he said, that this could be his final game in Philadelphia. I mean, they got a lot of really interesting choices to make. I mean, Jason Kelce, if he wants to play again, I would imagine he's only going to play in Philadelphia. I can't imagine he's going to go someplace else. Brandon Graham, though, he said, I'm playing. So that makes it difficult on this team moving forward, does it not?
He'll be back, Mike. He's going to be back. He's Howie Roseman's first official pick as a GM. They have a lot of history together, from it seeming like a bust to now all of a sudden being a guy who could win his second Super Bowl, which would be more than Earl Thomas, by the way, if he does. And I just think that if you look at the state of the Eagles' defensive line, Fletcher Cox and Javon Hargrave, no sure shot that they're both back. Brandon Graham knows what he is at this point, and that's a really good rotational defensive end. I can't imagine that Brandon's going to be out there looking to make, $25 million, although if somebody offers him to him, it would be hard to say no. But Brandon's always called Philadelphia home. Josh Sweat next year will be in the final year of a 3-year deal. Hard to believe. Hassan Reddick will be in the second year of a 3-year deal. Oh, wait, Sweat is either going to be in the third or I think this is the last year of his deal next year. So they're not exactly, outside of Reddick and Sweat, like really deep at pass rusher. Derek Barnett will probably not be back, I imagine. And they really don't have a young developmental pass rusher, so they'll probably get one in the draft. But I can't see Brandon Graham not being a third or fourth DN for this team next year if he wants to come back.
And then you got Fletcher Cox in the same situation. Now, they already cut him once and then brought him back for $14 million. Are they going to play Ring Around the Rosie with him again?
Yeah, see, that one is a little bit tougher. I'm more sold that Brandon will be back than Fletcher, even though Fletcher's also been a great player for the Eagles in his career. But as you just mentioned, they cut him once already and let him out there to test the market if he wanted to, before they brought him back at a really, really big number for his age and for his production. And, that defensive tackle is going to be an issue that they really have to replenish. They got to get young talent. They've got to be able to coach up Jordan Davis so that he can be more than a one-down player, which he is right now. So they've got a lot of work to do in that area, and they may feel like they have to rebuild it, whereas when they look at edge rusher, they may feel like they've got the perfect role for Brandon to be a situational edge rusher where he's not playing a lot of snaps and he's not killing your cap at the same time. Now, obviously, if Brandon wants to get paid real big, then maybe the conversation is different, but I have a hard time seeing Brandon Graham not being an Eagle next year if he wants to play.
And then, of course, there's Kelce and that whole thing there. They drafted Jurgens with Kelce's kind of, elbow grease there. But the way he's playing right now, does Jason Kelce say, you know what, I'm loving this team. I love where this team is. I want to play again.
He could, man. We've learned our lesson with Jason Kelce because we know he's pondered retirement each of the last few years. He's taken his time. There have been some times where we just kind of thought, hey, that's going to be when you get the feedback from people who know him that, yeah, he's really thinking about taking his time. Well, there's that expression where if you have your foot halfway out the door, you're really out the door. But that has not been the case with Jason. He really has evaluated it. That he gets his shipment of beer from the coaches and decides he wants to play again, and he plays at a really high level. So if he wants to play again next year, he's your starting center for the Philadelphia Eagles. And Cam Jurgens is most likely, if they can coach him up to be it, your right guard, because I imagine then Isaac Seumalo wouldn't be back. He's on an expiring contract this year.
Yeah, Seumalo is a guy. We were looking through yesterday about how big this game is because of all the guys. Seumalo is a guy that just seems like there's just not any way that you can afford to bring him back, especially with how good they draft and develop players on the offensive line, right? I mean, he would seem like a complete long shot to return.
Yeah, I mean, I think if he didn't have the injury history that he has, and I know he stayed healthy this year, but, last year and the year before, then maybe it's a different discussion. Maybe, because he is a really good player, Mike. And with the fact that we don't talk about him that much shows you that he's a good player because that's how it goes with offensive linemen. But you got Jurgens, and I don't think that they'd want to go since they have the option to do it, and they have to make so many other financial decisions on guys. I think they're going to have to go roll with Jurgens at right guard if that be the case, and let Seumalo walk, because Seumalo will probably get a very good contract on the free agent market the same way Hala Puluti Vaitai got one when his contract was up.
And you would imagine Dillard's probably going to get paid by somebody too, right?
Yeah, it's funny. Adam and I were just talking about it on the pod. He's probably the least talked about free agent to be on the Eagles because he doesn't really, play. He's a backup who's not really had to play much. But he's going to be a fascinating case study on what a guy who was a former first-round pick, who didn't have a good start, and didn't necessarily rehab his image through his play because he hasn't played that much, but he has done all right when he's played, and he has reinvented himself as far as his body. He's much bigger, he's much stronger, and it's obviously a position that everybody's always looking to find somebody who can play at left tackle. So he might be a rare case of a guy who winds up getting a pretty good deal in free agency on what he might be instead of what he's been.
Yeah, I agree. I imagine he's going to get paid. I figure someone's going to say, you know what, this guy was a first-round pick. And I don't know, would he be a guy that they would look at to play guard? Probably not. They're not going to pay him to come back and play him at guard.
Who, the Eagles?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine they'd play him at guard. They've got Landon Dickerson there on the left side, and it's clear, even if they have a right guard opening, that with Seumalo leaving, they like Jack Driscoll on the right, they like Andre Dillard on the left. And that's pretty clear based on their actions and how they've made substitutions this year. So I can't imagine that they would want Andre Dillard to play right guard.
Yeah,
you never know.
That's interesting, Jeff, though, too, because you mentioned Driscoll. Could he be a candidate to, people I don't think realize how I watch these last two games, and to me, Dickerson, Kelce, and Seumalo, man, they're the MVPs of these last two games. And you have to replace Seumalo and what he does, how athletic he is. And let's say it's Jack Driscoll. You might get a guy who gives you a solid effort, but the athleticism you're losing and what you can do with Seumalo, that really changes the dynamics of the whole offense. And if you lost Kelce along with it, man, that would be a completely different look.
Yeah, that's kind of why I think that Jurgens is sort of the heir apparent because, he is a guy who played tight end and then switched to center at Nebraska. So he's a pretty athletic guy like Kelce, right, at that position. So he tested well at the combine, I'm pretty sure. So if you put him at right guard and you're looking to do some of the same, inside zones and traps and, pulls that you do with Seumalo, they probably feel that they can do that with Jurgens, probably even more so than Driscoll, because Jurgens is seemingly the better athlete.
A couple quickies, because these are the most difficult ones, are Hargrave, Bradbury, and Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, right? I would imagine Hurts is the first order of business. Those three guys might be next. So all, none, one, how many of those guys can realistically come back?
I mean, the issue is that, wait, you said Hargrave, you said
Bradbury and Chauncey Gardner-Johnson.
Bradbury. What they are going to battle is that all three of those guys are going to get reset market type of money, most likely. I mean, Gardner-Johnson was hurt, but he had such a great first half, and he's shown now he can be a great slot and a great safety. I mean, do you remember what Patrick Robinson got from the Saints just based on the year that he had in 2017 with the Eagles? I mean, that guy was left for dead in training camp. Then he has this great year, and then they're signing a 4-year deal with the Saints. That was for really good money. C.J. Gardner-Johnson's a lot younger than Robinson was at that time. So I imagine he's going to get a pretty darn good deal. Same thing with, even though Bradbury's 29, going to be 30. I mean, he just like I mentioned with Patrick Robinson, he's going to get a good deal. So can the Eagles really afford to retain all three of those guys when they're probably going to get top? I'm not saying they're going to get the number one at their position. Hargrave might, but they're all going to be sort of top 5 at the time that they sign their deal, and that's going to be really difficult for the Eagles.
Well, that's why this game is big, because they have a lot of difficult decisions to make. We just touched on a couple, because Miles Sanders, he has to get he's a free agent. By the way, this one's under the radar. I just want to get your opinion on this because of the way that the organization thinks. Gardner Minshew is a veteran who has 20-plus starts in this league. He makes less than $800,000. We know what they think about the backup quarterback position. They're not going to bring him back, I would imagine. So you're going to be going into a spot where I remember, like Chase Daniels, them paying him like $8 million to be the backup here. So with that decision also coming, that's another interesting one that you already got to pay your starter. He's going to get astronomical money. What are you going to do with the backup quarterback position? We know how much they value that here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you shouldn't be surprised if, all of a sudden the second or third round of the draft, they're taking a quarterback, especially if when they wind up signing Jalen Hurts to a long-term deal for a lot of money. And it's, and again, it's not about you're worried that Jalen Hurts is going to get hurt. And again, Jalen was drafted to be a high-end backup to Carson Wentz, who could play and win you games if need be on a rookie deal. That's why they drafted him. That is the absolute truth. Not because they thought Carson was going to be like completely injured all the time and not fulfill the contract or whatever. They did not see all of it coming. But the same logic and rationale for that would apply if they wind up taking a quarterback pretty high in the draft coming up. And they do have 2 picks in the first round, so they do have the ability to kind of move up and down and maybe acquire some picks to have that quote-unquote luxury type of pick, be it in the second round or third round. So I think you should definitely look out for it. If not, then you look out and see the same way they got Gardner Minshew is maybe there's another backup quarterback who's played well in this league that they think that they can acquire for a late round pick and be that low salary, high end backup.
All right, Moshe, I don't want it to sound like it's a loss and we're trying to go to the offseason already, but I think it's just detailing why this game is so important for this franchise. And look, you get Hurts, you have Sirianni, you've got A.J. Brown. I saw this today. I don't know if you came across this. They have the 32nd ranked money in their skill position players. Their skill players are the lowest paid in all of football against the cap. Their offense as a whole is 30th in the league against the cap. So they're doing this with a very low-paid offense. You're not going to get away with that for a long, long time, and that's another reason why this game is very important. By the way, Jalen Hurts, 1% of the team's salary cap would be the lowest of any Super Bowl quarterback against the cap, next to Nick Foles back in 2017. Patrick Mahomes, by the way, is 19% of the Chiefs' salary cap. Just to put it in perspective, he would be the highest of any quarterback since the year 2000. He's Geoff Mosher, the Inside the Birds podcast, and Inside the Birds will be in Arizona on Radio Row, so you'll get plenty of great content from them all week long. Jeff, what's your schedule out there? When are you guys heading out? When will you have shows from Arizona?
Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. The plan right now is from noon to 4. We'll be doing tons of live streams, getting a lot of interviews in, Mike.
All right. And, of course, the Inside the Birds guys with us right here on Football at 4, here on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. Andrew DeCecco tomorrow, and Adam Kaplan, I believe, right, is back on. No, I can't remember the schedule. Maybe Adam's back on Friday.
I think Kaplan Friday, yeah.
All right, there we go. Jeff, we will see you in Arizona, man.
Looking forward to it, Mike. Have a good one.
All right, Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds, good conversation. There's some thoughts on the offseason and why this game is so important, guys.